Welcome back, players. I'm Jack36Cancel, and this is Coco the Weiss Cat, and in this video, we're going to be talking about Standby. Now, Standby is nothing new to Weiss Schwarz. However, for those just discovering the game, of which I'm sure there are many of you watching, Standby is a very different part of Weiss Schwarz deck building and gameplay, and thus deserves its own video. So we'll talk about what Standby is, why it's different, and a bit about how it's utilized in its own deck. First things first, to talk about Standby, we need to talk about climaxes. Climaxes in Weiss Schwarz come in all shapes and sizes. Well, metaphorically speaking. They cancel damage while they're in your deck, and when you play them from your hand to the climax zone during your turn, your characters get stronger and hit harder. The vast majority of climaxes in Weiss Schwarz are 1k1, meaning that while they're in play, your characters get plus 1000 power and plus 1 soul. Some vary on this idea a bit, like giving 2 characters 2k and 1 soul, or giving all of your characters plus 1 soul and giving you a free stock in some form. However, 1k1s also have unique triggers that resolve when we trigger them during the attack phase, like Comeback, which lets you salvage a character, or Treasure, which lets you take the climax to your hand and put the top card of your deck into stock instead. Standby is another one of these triggers, but it's a very unique trigger that works a bit differently than the others. Standby climaxes, when played to the climax zone, don't give your characters any soul or any power. They don't give you stock, they don't draw you cards, or anything of the sort. Instead, when you play a Standby climax, you perform the Standby trigger, which is what happens when you trigger it during the attack phase, and that ability reads as such. Choose up to one character in your waiting room whose level is X or lower and place them on your stage rested in any position where X is equal to your level plus 1. So if you're level 1 and you play a Standby climax, you can choose a level 2 character in your waiting room and put them anywhere on the stage rested. Also, if you're level 2 and you trigger a Standby climax during your attack phase for your attack trigger, you can choose level 3 in your waiting room and put it onto the stage rested. This lets you play characters before you hit their level, but since they're rested, you can't attack with them the turn you standby them out, though some characters with Standby climax combos, like Nina from the quintessential quintuplets or Pyrrha from Ruby, actually combo to let you stand and attack with them the turn they come out. Get the idea? So obviously, this is a major trade-off. You get to play characters that are above your level for free from the waiting room, but you lose out on a lot of momentum in gameplay by giving up the power and the soul of a 1k1 or similar climax. It also should be noted that when you stand by a character from the waiting room, you do not have to have the character's associated color in your clock, and you do not have to pay the stock cost for that character. Further, many standby climax combos, unlike 1k1s, generally are not on characters that give you major advantage, like searching your deck or doing a lot of damage to close the game. There are exceptions, of course, and these exceptions stand out as powerhouses inside the standby Rolodex. Take Eris from Mushoku Tensei for example. She may cost a stock to play, but on combo play, she mills 2 and lets you salvage a character whose level is X or lower, where X is the milled card's combined level. There are other level 1 standby climax combos that let you salvage, like Miko from Hololive or Kanade from Rascal, but they only get to 5500 to perform a reverse salvage combo on their own, and thus they're far weaker than your average reverse salvage combo on 1k1s. As for level 3s, there's Gawain, who on attack with combo lets you pay 2 and burn 2. While not bad, and keeping in mind that she does bring more things to the table besides damage, that's still a bit expensive for 2 damage. When compared to another modern level 3 finishing combo on a 1k1 that does 2 damage on attack, like Hosho Marine, who on attack lets you pay 1, pitch 1, burn 2 on combo, and also replaces herself in your hand, gives you a free stock, and also lets you dig for her own climax combo, you can kinda see how the standby element of Gawain's combo leeches some of the power from her actual finishing power. There are a select few other standby finishing combos, like Ruby from Ruby, who rests herself to burn 3 and clock kick, Benomura from Slime 1, who burns 4 on reverse, Millen from Slime 2, who lets you play a pretty obnoxious event on reverse, Kasumi from Bang Dream, who does whatever the hell Kasumi does, I don't know anything about Bang Dream, and Nene from Hololive, which has like a 50-50 chance of maybe burning your opponent. There's actually a few more, like Marceline from Venture Time, who you pay 2 and pitch 2 to burn 3 on reverse with, or Mikey from TRV, which lets you pay 3 and pitch 1 to deal damage based on the combined levels of cards on the bottom of your opponent's deck, and who could forget the infamous Kurumi from Day Day Live, who was so unbelievably good that she was the first card ever restricted down from a 4 of to a 2 of in constructed tournament play in English Weiss Schwarz. Okay, there are actually a few more of these than I thought. However, despite some of these having decent finishing power, most are balanced out either by high cost or another point of failure, such as having to reverse a battle opponent to actually get the combo off, or a chance that the ability misses entirely, or some combination of those. This, again, is because of the power that running 4 standby triggers that can be utilized at any point in the game adds to your deck outside the actual climax combo. Notably, Nina from the quintessential quintuplets is on attack pay 1, pitch 1, burn 3, which is far and above any standby combo that we knew before she dropped a few weeks ago. At least in English. Generally, the fact that the climax combo is on a standby trigger means that it's going to be balanced to reflect the fact that you're getting the standby trigger, but then there's Nino. Okay, so what we listed seems like a lot, and I'm probably forgetting 1 or 2, But now compare this to the litany of combos that exist all throughout the game in different sets that aren't on standby combos. When you look at the literal thousands of combos that exist in Weiss Schwarz outside standby, it becomes obvious that they're not the norm. However, for the tiny portion of cards tied to it, standby is something that's pervasive in most talk about the game, and that's because it's a major game-changing ability. Decks that run standby are a major part of the Weiss Schwarz tournament meta, and of course make for very fun and big powerful decks. But what makes standby so game-changing? You're just playing out the same characters but from the waiting room, right? Well, not exactly. Let's explore that concept. Standby is game-changing because standby is also deck-changing, meaning that the inclusion of the standby trigger radically changes deck construction choices. The fact that you can play things from your waiting room for free means that you can afford to play things in your deck that would otherwise be very inefficient. Take this 2/2 Lisbeth for example. She's a 2/2 10k with 2 soul that also has some version of Encore. Playing this in a regular SAO deck would be very inefficient because 2 stock is the same cost as a finisher or an early play, both of which are much better investments for the limited resource of stock at the point of the game where you can play her from your hand. In fact, 2/2s before standby were considered by default as unplayable because they were so clunky. Even when Bushiroad would print 2/2s that refunded stock somehow or had amazing abilities when they attacked, players pretty much ignored them. However, the equation on that changes when you're level 1, play a standby climax, and slam this thing down on the stage for free. Now it's free for you, and a big problem that your opponent is going to have to deal with for most of the game, or until you get tired of it and play something even dumber. In fact, the 2/2 10k with hand encore is now a staple in most standby decks because of how efficient and problematic it is because of the standby trigger. Nino has an advanced version of this 2/2 that's even more annoying. The same is true for the 1/17500 with hand encore. This is a classic profile you'll find in most Weiss Schwarz titles, but most decks choose not to run any because it's not super good to play from hand and spend a stock on. However, in a standby deck, opening the game by playing a standby on turn 0 and putting one on the board from your waiting room is one of the most brutal things you can do to your opponent. This is why the standby trigger is so game warping, because it lets you break the rules and put enormous and often problematic cards on the board for free. Even if your opponent makes them go away somehow, it's not as if you broke your back to play them, or as if you don't have more standby triggers to activate and just bring back all the things they dealt with before. Now all this said, you do have to remember that standby as a climax adds no soul and no power, so you may be asking how the average standby deck manages to keep up in the damage race. The answer? Soul triggers. Soul triggers add damage when you attack, and since you're playing a deck with a lot of cards that cost stock to play, you likely have a lot more soul triggers than the average deck. Efficient 1-0s comprise the majority of strong mid-game options, but because of their efficiency, they lack soul triggers. The characters that standby decks play, however, like beefy 1s and 2s, and often an overabundance of level 3s, all have soul triggers. Level 2s and 3s that come out early also have 2 soul, which adds to standby's damage momentum when they stand and swing next turn. Borne out across the game, this means that the average attack has a chance to trigger for more soul than a regular deck, and of course, the standby climax itself has a soul trigger. However, because standby climaxes add no soul, this does mean that a 1k1 deck will swing in for more consistent and larger damage every turn on average, especially during the mid-game. One other way standby decks keep up the damage race is by attacking directly. Now, usually this isn't something you have very much control over, but since standby decks field such large characters, their opponents often have to surrender board in order to keep the pressure on. This means that on the return swing, standby decks, on average, can make more direct attacks. Opponents can also choose to side attack, however, this also kind of equalizes the damage race. But going back to level 3s, this is another place where standby decks have more options. Level 3s in Weiss Schwarz has some very powerful abilities, especially those that might shine in your back row. However, when deciding to pay their 2 stock cost versus playing a level 3 that can kill your opponent outright with your finishing combo, the choice is often clear. But what if you didn't have to pay their cost? Standby allows you to play some of these powerful, high-level characters without worrying about stalling out your finishing game. Often, these characters give your front line a major boost in power, making your already high wall even higher. Even on that note, standing your finishers by means that you don't have to pay any stock for them, meaning that you can pay their actual ability costs much easier, like that 3/2 Gawain that burns 2 for 2 stock for example. This is also true for backups with more taxing abilities, like rest counters that cost 5 stock to use, or expensive event backups that decrease soul. If you're not paying for your characters, you can build stock very quickly, and if all of your characters are high level and high power, side attacking against your characters to avoid problematic counters isn't a very good option. Finally, one aspect of standby decks that's just as important as the beefy targets themselves is discard outlets. Being that standby decks play a lot of cards that are higher in level and are very taxing to play from your hand, a standby player wouldn't want to end up with a handful of 2/2s and 1/1s that they couldn't afford to play. After all, to standby one of these juicy targets, they had to be in your waiting room. To facilitate this, standby decks play cards known as discard outlets or filtering cards. These are cards that have effects like discard a card and top check 4 to add a character, or discard a card, reveal the top card of your deck, and add it if it's a character. Standby decks also benefit from abilities that allow them to put cards from their deck into the waiting room very quickly, with effects like, when you play this card, put the top 3 cards of your deck into your waiting room. One of the worst things in the world is triggering standby and not having anything to stand by. After all, the standby trigger is how standby decks gain momentum and apply pressure to their opponents, so not being able to standby is a major setback. So an integral part of a standby deck is ways and cards to help avoid that scenario. So as we see, standby changes your game plan at all phases of the game, and it lets you radically shake up your deck construction. But let's summarize the basic concepts. Standby is a trigger that, when revealed, lets you choose a character from your waiting room to put on the stage rested, whose level can be one higher than yours or lower if you want. The standby climax is special because when played from your hand to the climax zone, it adds no power or soul, but allows you to perform the trigger action, which usually only activates during the trigger phase when revealed for an attack. Because you can play cards with standby regardless of cost or color, standby decks utilize many more costly, beefier, and more powerful cards that ordinary decks would have a hard time navigating within their game plan, or maybe inefficient if played from your hand. This allows them to create a stage with very high power, and often effects that are annoying to deal with for an opponent for very little cost. This also allows standby decks to pay for the cost of card abilities more easily, which include expensive but powerful backups like rest counters or anti-damage counters. This is also true of level 3 back row characters and finishing climax combos. Because their game plan is so different, however, standby decks look a lot different than normal 1k1 decks. They run a lot more soul triggers to keep up in the damage race since their climaxes add no solar power, and they run a lot of discard outlets and deck milling effects to ensure that their standby targets are in the waiting room when they need them. Pro tip: many popular standby targets have Hand Encore, and Hand Encore is the perfect discard outlet to put your big beefy target into the waiting room to annoy your opponent with next turn. So standby seems like it's a powerful deck archetype, and make no mistake, it very much is. You might be asking at this point, well, how the heck do you beat something like this? Well, remember players, you don't win Weiss Schwarz by killing your opponent's characters. Even if a standby deck has a massive center stage with level 3s who all have 20k power each, they still lose to a level 0 attacking them for lethal damage. Every character in Weiss Schwarz does damage to players, and no matter how big or scary your stage is, it won't stop you from hitting level 4 and losing the game. This is where the normal 1k1 decks and the other variations of the classic 1k1 climax can win out against even the biggest, fattest standby targets. They're efficient, they're streamlined, and because their climaxes add soul and power, they swing in for consistent damage each turn while keeping their hands full, their stock clean, and their decks compressed. They also have climax combos that consistently generate advantage, many of which don't need to interact with an opponent's board at all to be good at what they do. And finally, their finishing combos often swing in for high damage and can be very threatening. The choice to run a standby trigger and all the trappings that go with it can often come at the price of avoiding techie options, spicy one-ups, deck control effects, advantage engines like combos that search or salvage, and finishers that can reliably put out game-ending damage without having to reverse a battle opponent or pay a high cost. You can put these cards in standby decks, however, it gums up the standby game plan and your deck will generally run worse. This makes sets that have powerful deck control and damage output options despite being standby-centric extremely powerful, like the quintessential quintuplets Nino deck having strong efficient finishers, as well as good filtering and deck control, and Mushoku Tensei having built-in advantage engines. So when faced with a standby deck, even a powerful one, remember, just swing in for damage, compress your deck, and keep your hand and stock full. In fact, Danmachi, a 1k1 deck with efficient combos and low-cost events, is a nightmare for standby decks because of its ability to consistently put itself in a compressed deck state, as well as hit high power and climb over the wall of standby targets, in addition to some particularly annoying other tech. Regardless of that, however, standby is a really awesome ability in Weiss Schwarz, and it's fun to play. But remember, putting big dumb things on the board doesn't win you the game automatically. Well players, this is where I'm going to cap this one off. I hope you learned a lot about standby and its unique strategy inside Weiss Schwarz. Hopefully it gave you some insight on how to handle scary standby decks you might encounter, or inspired you to pick one up and try one of your own. Personally, standby is one of my favorite deck archetypes to play, and sharing it with you players at home was a lot of fun. Look forward to more sets that come out with even more amazing standby combos, and I'll see you in the next video. And as always, thanks for watching. Peace.